Hello, welcome to the channel. My name is Danny Wilten, and the purpose of this video is going to be to do an overview of the material that has been covered on this channel since 2011. I like to do these once in a while. The last one I did was in August of 2013, but as time continues to progress, there is so much material that is surfacing regarding the information I'm going to be showing you in this particular video and what has been discovered, that it's necessary once in a while, and especially for those of you who may be new to the channel, to give you kind of an overview as to the material that I am presenting, the discoveries that I'm presenting. All of the detailed videos that you can find that I think would be great for you to start with are included in a playlist I have at the top of my YouTube channel called Important Starter Videos, I believe is the name of the title. And they contain most of the really good information. I would recommend starting with the video called Black Hole Sun that you'll find in there, which kind of is a 45-minute just a dump of a lot of material. It goes very quickly, but it also covers a lot of information. The other reason I like to make videos like this is because there are people that will typically go all the way back to 2011 and start taking a look at the discoveries there. And although that is okay, what you will find is that since 2011 there has been an evolution of an understanding of what is going on. Now, I don't claim to know everything. I don't claim to have all of the answers. But I do claim to, when I have discovered something and I'm pretty sure of it, I come out there and say it. And for those of you who are familiar with the stuff that I've been putting out, I'm very hesitant to say this is what it is until I know for sure that I understand what I'm looking at and what we're dealing with. So what we're going to do is go over the material in kind of a chronological order. I'm going to start with my qualifications and what has actually occurred on the surface, and then show you what I have done in order to back up the material. Now, I have also would like to put out to any scholars, any people who would like to challenge the material. I welcome you to do it. My feeling is that the discoveries that I have made cannot be debunked. I come from an analyst background, and I attack things from every possible angle. There are some things that are so in your face that you either accept it because you're scientific and you can see what is in front of you, or you don't. And that brings us to the next topic, and that is, what is truth? Well, truth is a very interesting topic because the ancients, a long time ago, the ancient Egyptians, they had an understanding that when they went to the afterlife, that their heart was weighed against the feather of truth. To them, truth was more important than anything, and it dealt with your integrity. But truth is also something that not everybody is ready to accept. Not everybody, according to The Matrix, if you remember that movie, is ready to be unplugged at this time. And truth does not allow for clinging to something that you believe is familiar to you and not being able to look at other things. Some of the things that we're going to be looking at go into the mysteries. And when I say the mysteries, they go into things that are beyond what we may call standard physical scientific research. But they also do things such as challenge orthodox type religions. Truth is not found by clinging on to one specific type of thing. What truth wants is, truth wants you to come to the table and drop everything you know as far as your partial beliefs to it, your biased beliefs. And you have to be able to accept anything when it comes to you and say, well, if this is what I'm seeing and this is what I'm confirming, then this is what it is. I think it's also important to understand that you hear a lot of people out there saying that, oh, well, that's all, this is false, and this is just false, and especially when it comes to Orthodox religions. They just say, well, all this is false religion. And they have these immediate opinions about what truth is. But when you ask them, well, what do you think about this, that, and the other? Oh, well, I've never read that. Well, how can you not know what is false, or how do you know what is true and what is false if you've never explored and compared and looked around? And the answer is typically, oh, I don't need to look around. I just need to read this one thing. And that is not truth. That is not approaching things from an aspect of wanting to get to the truth. But the same applies on the scientific side of things, because our science today, our modern science, takes the same approach. It doesn't want to accept anything regarding any type of consciousness that may exist in the universe, something that deals with metaphysics or things beyond what we can discover using typical physical scientific research. And that is also a perspective or a stance that is not associated with truth. What you'll also find is that these mainstream Egyptologists, mainstream archaeologists, many of us are familiar with the fact that these people have gone to school, they have been taught certain things, and they are either afraid to, because they're afraid that they may lose their job, or that they may be discredited, or what have you. And so they are afraid to, or very wary about moving out of the mainstream understanding of whether it be archaeology, whether it be Egyptology, and so forth. And so this is also a perspective and a stance that does not accept truth, because it does not allow for the exploration of all different types of things. When you want to find truth for anything, you have to be able to lay everything down. You have to be able to approach it from a very analytical point of view and compare the data from all aspects, all angles, all cultures, as much data as you can find. Put it in front of you and see where the common truths are. Once you do that, it's the same as finding a liar in the room of 100 people. If you want to find the liar in the room of 100 people, well, you don't ask just one person, or you don't just ask the liar, because he's always going to tell you what he wants to tell you. You ask everybody in the room. And if everybody in the room, or 99% of them, have a very similar, not necessarily the exact, because we have to remember that language, culture, and things like this also play a part in the understanding. So you may find that there are very similar types of things that are being talked about, but then when you see one that stands out that doesn't seem to jive with all the other ones, well, there you found your liar in the room. So we have to understand that over history, history has been modified, history has been reinterpreted. It's been interpreted by sometimes those people in power who want to interpret things to keep people in the dark about certain subjects. So the only way that we can really ever find the truth is to take all of the data from all the different angles, put it in front of us, and see what comes out of it. And that's the approach that I take. So let me tell you a little bit about my background real quick. My background is I've been a systems analyst now for the last 13, 14 years, and basically what that consists of is in the computer field. I do analysis or business analysis for very large companies, or I have in the past, designing very large websites. I dig into analysis, I find out what the customer wants, and I design the application or the website or what have you, but it digs very, very, very deep, very into the details. So the approach that I take is a very scientific approach, but yet at the same time, I take an approach that allows for the usage of the right brain, more of the artistic, intuitive side as well. And it is my feeling, along with many of the ancient philosophers, that it is a balance of both sides that allow you to come to the truth. Not everybody can do this. Not everybody will do this. Not everybody will accept truth, even if it's right in front of their face. It doesn't matter. Some people must cling to whatever is comfortable for them to cling to. Some people get very upset when they're taken out of their comfort zones, as I have experienced over my discovery period. However, what I have done as an analyst, which you will not find most people do out there, is I have presented so much evidence and attacked things from so many different angles that it really cannot be debunked, what I'm going to be showing you in this video. What it stems from is what began is I discovered some images inside of these older cathedrals around Europe, which we will take a look at some of these images in just a few minutes. These images were images that should not have been, people should not have been able to see. For example, there are images of the Orion Nebula, which is what you will find all over my channel, and people will wonder, why is he so obsessed with the Orion Nebula? Well, I'm just going where the data is taking me, and the data keeps pointing me to that exact same area. But we see over history that the Orion Nebula is inside these various cathedrals. But what turns it into a mystery is that the understandings of this area of the cosmos, when some of these paintings are done, and most of them are done, they have an understanding of this area of the cosmos that they should not have had. For example, there are some paintings that happened before we even invented the telescope that are very highly detailed. There are some paintings that show an understanding of the infrared spectrum of this area, which we didn't have the technology for several hundred years ago. But the images are there nevertheless, and they are repeatable, and they all tell a certain story. And what we'll see is that the scientific approach that I take is very respectable, and I'm going to give you some examples, even using an application on the web. But based on the discoveries that I've made, and the approach that I took was to take a look at the art and the symbolism first. Because as we know, there are texts all over the place, and the texts are many times obscure. Many times they're written in parables. So it's hard to understand, and we have many people constantly fighting or arguing over what this says versus what that says. So I took the approach of digging into these cathedrals and looking at the rich symbolism and the rich artwork. And this was the best thing I could have ever done, because it pointed me to an area where people don't give much attention to, but it has pointed me to truth over and over, and as I will say, it has never contradicted itself. It has always given me truth every time. So, based on the discoveries that I've made, I went out to take a look at things all over the place. I came with an empty slate. I didn't have any expectations. I didn't have anything that had to be a certain way, and it is because of that that's allowed me to find truth. Some of the texts that I've read, and this is not going to be a complete list, but it's going to show you some of my areas where I have researched. But I've read the Pyramid texts, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is also called the Book of the Dead, which is a misnomer. The Upanishads, the Diamond Sutra. I've done much research into the Kabbalah. Kabbalah becomes very important in all of this. The Torah, the Book of Concealed Mystery. The Book of Enoch. The occult chemistry, which digs into clairvoyance and understanding into matter at the atomic level by Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater. Another thing that I try to do is that I have noticed during my research is that over the last 50 years or so, there's a lot of crazy information, just things from all over the place that have been inserted into the real or truthful data. So I typically will try to go find the guys that wrote texts and books 100 years ago or more. That's what I typically try to do, because I know there isn't so much of an agenda as there is now to dump a bunch of false information out with the good information that they're doing right now. So I've looked at also the tarot cards, the Corpus Hermetica, which are the different books with Hermes Trismegistus, The Gospel of the Egyptians was a Gnosis text, same with the Gospel of Thomas. The Kabbalion, which goes into Hermetic philosophy, an understanding of the principles of Hermetics, which science continually is proving all the time, such as the principle of vibration, which everything moves and everything vibrates, which is the same as what they consider string theory that they believe they discovered in the 1960s and 1970s. I love Blavatsky, and I love Manly Hall. I think Manly P. Hall, which is a 33rd degree Mason, is probably my very favorite. And I will go into why I like these particular people more in just a bit. But I made my discoveries first. And then I went out to find who was showing that the discoveries that I made and was putting the pieces together, helping me put the pieces together, and Blavatsky and Manly Hall did that. One thing I like about both of them is that you will not find, and what I believe that Orthodox religions do not like, is that they compare all of the various cultures. People try to discredit them, but people try to do that with everybody. You can always attack. You can always attack an Alex Jones or a Blavatsky or a Freemason or anything. You can always character attack any of them. But this is also not the stance or the approach of truth, because what you have to do is you have to look at the data that is being provided. And what I like about Blavatsky and Manly Hall is that they provide data from all of the various cultures. And Blavatsky, for example, it's proved that she has visited these other countries and visited these masters, and they have taught her stuff. She goes across culture from Kabbalah to Hinduism to Buddhism to all these various cultures, and she presents the data, and what happens is you can see that condensed data. She backs her stuff up in her text. Manly Hall, another wonderful person that does the same thing. I've also looked at Gnosis and Gnosis creation myths, Neoplatonism, Carl Jung, which you guys are probably familiar with, but he's the person that came up with the archetypes and the collective unconscious, which deals with symbolism that comes from people's dreams. Terence McKenna, many of you are probably familiar with. I've listened to his philosophy. Alan Watts. I have read most of the Holy Bible. I use it more as a reference material than I do anything, but it's also important to understand that I do analysis across multiple versions, because we have so many different versions of the Bible. We have to be able to compare the verses in their parallels. I have researched much cathedral art, Christian symbolism that goes along with that, and then also universal symbolism. I call it universal symbolism because it is most symbolism, it is derived from nature. Just like the triangle with the eye in it that I showed you at the very beginning of this video. That would be something that's universal symbolism. And we also see it across cultures as well, and it has very sacred and important meanings to it. Because of the type of work that I do, I've also explored image and face recognition algorithms. And you'll understand why in just a minute, because I had to prove that what I was seeing is possible to see. To the scientific mind, it will be extremely obvious. To the unscientific mind, it needs some explaining. So that I have explored this area. Mayan creation story. Looked at the Mayan culture and their sacred Popol Vuh, which describes the three hearthstones of creation. I've explored ancient hieroglyphs and symbolism. I've gone across culture from ancient Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Sumerian, and Mayan, and there is a common fundamental truth that exists in all of them, as well as some very interesting geometrical similarities as well that we'll also take a look at. A lot of this has to do with the human body. And so in sacred geometry, I've explored the human body and the nervous system in detail. I've also discovered similarities with the human body in geography and also in astronomy. Cathedral art and Christian symbolism, I've already covered that. Temple architecture, Egyptian, Hindu, and Christian. And this is important because when we understand that the human body is an important factor in all of this, we will see why it also ties to the temple architecture as well. There's also sacred geometry from various hieroglyphs and reliefs that are very similar we will take a look at. Ari Schwaller de Lubicz, who studied in Egypt for 17 years. His specific temple that he looked at was the Temple of Luxor, which turned out to be a temple that was designed to carry the various areas of the human body. And as you went into the various rooms, you could read the hieroglyphs, or he read the hieroglyphs and studied them and found that they were associated to those various parts of the body. Also, I've read his document called Ancient Egypt, Science and the Evolution of Consciousness, which is very important, understanding the ancients and how they thought as far as symbolism. I've read about as much as you can find on Hermes Trismegistus. I've also read works by Annie Besant, C.W. Leadbeater, and I've also looked at works in alchemical art by Athanasius Kircher and others, such as Bohm and other people that have produced such wonderful alchemical art for us. So this is probably not a complete list, but it gives you an idea of all the different areas that I've taken a look at and researched in order to put all this data in front of me and come to some kind of an understanding of what it is that I've been discovering inside these cathedrals and in ancient Egypt. Okay, so now let's take a look at how all of this stuff kicked off, which was actually by accident. And this image that you're looking at right here, the image on the left, is the high altar of a church called Karlskirche. It's located in Vienna, Austria, and this was built in 1737. Now this image that you see right here is an infrared version of the Orion Nebula. Obviously, we didn't have infrared capability at that time. It was discovered because I happened to have an image of the Orion Nebula infrared up on one screen, and I was browsing cathedral art on my other screen. And it was when I saw both of them together that I saw the match. So it was actually kind of by accident. But here's the deal. So we can talk about this and we can say, well, there's a lot of arguments, but we're going to break these down scientifically. And we're going to see how the mind, how the right brain is processing images, and how we can actually confirm what we're looking at. Because the first things that you typically hear are, well, you're just seeing faces in the clouds. That's one thing. The other typical argument is that it's pareidolia. The other argument is that it's, well, you hear people talk about the ink blot test. You hear people saying all kinds of things. But these are programmed knee-jerk reactions where you don't have any kind of scientific support to back themselves up when they make these claims. But what we're going to do is we're going to break this down scientifically. When you first look at either of these images on the left and the right, the first thing that your mind processes is the overall image. The overall image gives us some very interesting aspects. It gives us the arch that you see highlighted in blue all the way around. You get the same side-to-side thing going on right here with this bright area in the middle. Your mind processes all that at once. But then, just like anything else, in order to find out that you're really looking at something important, is you start breaking it down into details. So let me kind of give you an example of what I'm talking about. First, let's take a look at what pareidolia is. Pareidolia is a psychological phenomenon involving a vague and random stimulus, often an image or sound being perceived as significant, a form of apophenia. Common examples: seeing images or animals of faces in the clouds, man on the moon, blah, blah, blah. So, first of all, I say that the whole idea of pareidolia is not a scientifically proven method. The reason why is because it is biased and therefore it does not meet the requirements for the scientific method. Because when you say that something being perceived as significant in data, that means that somebody has to decide whether that was significant or not. No one really gets to decide whether something is significant or not but you. Because if somebody else has never seen a particular pattern or an image or something like that before, but you have and you've seen it many, many times, then it's obviously significant to you. It may not be significant to them. And therefore, whether it is significant or not is purely subjective. And therefore, this does not meet the scientific method. Beyond that, it specifically states that it must be significant in order for it to be considered not pareidolia or apophenia. And that's what we're going to prove here next. You guys have probably heard of the ink blot test before. You see right up here where they just put something on a page and they say, what do you see in that image? Right? The method down here that is described is the general goal of the test is to provide data about cognition and personality variables such as motivation, response tendencies, cognitive operations, affectivity, and personal and interpersonal perceptions. The underlying assumption is that an individual class external stimuli based on personal specific perceptual tests, including needs, base motives, conflicts, and so forth. Okay. Now, what this is it is something that would be associated more or less with pareidolia. The difference between what we're dealing with here and what we're dealing with here is this is, if we were to take this right here and remove this left image, then we would be dealing with a situation of possible pareidolia, because the only thing that we have to deal with is one image, and therefore there's nothing to compare it to. Once you stick something next to this image and you begin comparing it, then it rules out the ink blot test, because now you're performing something called image recognition. And image recognition is something completely different than the ink blot test, because now you're performing a comparison. You're doing something very similar to what we see in shape recognition by computer algorithms and also face recognition. So this recognition here, the classical problem in computer vision, image processing, and machine vision is that it determines whether or not the image data contains some specific object feature or activity. So we're looking for specific things in the object. This task can normally be solved robustly and without effort by a human, but will not satisfactorily solved in human computer vision for the general case, arbitrary objects and arbitrary situations. The existing methods for dealing with this problem can at best solve it for only specific objects, such as simple geometric objects, polyhedra, human faces, printed or hand-written characters, or vehicles in specific situations. So the different varieties of recognition problem are object recognition. One or several pre-specified or learned objects, such as object classes, can be recognized usually together with their 2D positions in the image or 3D poses in the scene. Google Goggles provides a standalone program illustration of this function. Identification is when an individual instance of an object is recognized. Okay, so we are looking for particular things in these objects, in these images. This is what we have as image recognition. And the more things that you find within that, the closer you are, and then it becomes a mathematical probability situation. So in Google Goggles, for example, it's created, which can be found on, it is used for searches based on pictures taken by handheld devices. So you can take a picture with your phone, and it will look for that particular image or that landmark. Well, okay, so let's take a look at something. Let's imagine we're not dealing with the Orion Nebula for a second. Let's imagine that we're dealing with a United States map. Put your eyes on any one of those images. What do you notice first? The first thing that you notice is you notice the overall shape of the United States. But now let's take an example for a second. If I were somebody that's never seen the United States before, and you were showing me something and you said, well, this looks just like the United States. Well, could I not just say, oh, well, that's crazy. I don't see that. The images don't look necessarily the same. They're not the exact same picture. Well, how would you go to prove to me that what you are looking at is an actual picture of the United States? How would you compare it to a real picture of the United States? What would be your process for doing that? Well, the only way that you would be able to describe it to me or show me would be able to take the images, and remember we have lots of various images of the United States, but yet we all know what the United States looks like. So it doesn't have to be an exact replica for us to be able to realize that every one of these are pictures of the United States. What we have to be able to do is we have to be able to pick out specific characteristics in each one of these images to show that they are the same. That's the only way that you would be able to describe to somebody that you're seeing the same thing. For example, I might show you that, well, it's fat in the very center, and it has a stem that sticks out on the right-hand side, and we can see Florida sticks out here, and then Texas sticks out right down here. And these little characteristics would be the only way that you would be able to describe that. Now, you might go deeper, because the first thing that your eyes look at is the overall image. So now, in order to really prove for yourself and others that you're looking at the same thing, you would begin picking out the various shapes inside the United States that are characterized as states. So Texas has a specific characteristic to it. You would compare that against your other image, and you would find other things as well, all located in the exact same positions, their same rotations, and everything. And that is the only way that you would be able to describe it for somebody and prove to them that you're looking at the same thing if they had never seen the United States before. This is the same as a fingerprint. This is the same as any kind of object or image recognition that you might be dealing with. That's the process that you would have to go through. For example, we see that examples include identifications of a specific person's face, fingerprint, because a lot of times people say, oh, well, the brain is just wired to faces. Well, first of all, that is not a good scientific theory. The human brain is wired to faces for a reason, but it's not limited to faces. It's limited to anything that becomes familiar. And that may be a fingerprint or a signature, we might call it. Identification of handwritten signals or identification of a specific vehicle. When you recognize the letters on this page, you could perform the same kind of analysis with letters, with hieroglyphs, with images, with anything. And it all deals with your ability to be able to break them down into their subcomponents and show that you're dealing with the same thing, showing you're dealing with the same image. But now, what if the images are not exactly the same? Well, there is an application that can prove to you that it's still you still have the ability to be able to do this type of thing. So let me show you. Here's a prime example of one right here. Now you can see by looking at this is obviously not the real picture of the creation of Adam. You can see that there are a lot of the same characteristics, but you can see that it's not exactly the same. But is it possible? I mean, what if this were geography? What if this was the nebula? What if it was any image, but it wasn't exactly the same? Do you still have the ability to be able to recognize the same image? Well, Google can. We can plug that same image into TinEye, for example, and Google has found 4,515 results, and not all of them, as you will see, are the exact same image, but they carry the same characteristics, and they are very similar, as you can see here. And then we have different versions of it. Here's one where he's handing him a rifle, and it's not even the same person. So we have Google has the ability with this application to be able to perform similar searches based on various segments within the same image. So if we have a pattern match that we're dealing with, which is what we're dealing with right here, then we're using the same type of method that Google TinEye, Google Goggles, and any of these other image and shape recognition algorithms use, as well as face recognition, as well as any image recognition program. The first thing it does is it looks at probably the overall image. If you notice, the colors were not necessarily, they didn't have to be the same either in the creation of Adam image. So what it is doing is taking various sections of the image and is comparing against each other in order to satisfy the algorithm. And when it comes to a certain percentage level match, then it finds a match and it puts it on the screen. Now, the computer can do it to a certain level, but the human has a better ability to be able to do this thing, because the human can recognize much more subtle characteristics of image matching than you can with, say, a Google image recognition application. And so what we do in these types of situations is we break them down more and more and more. We look for specific patterns, like I'm doing right here. We have the overall thing. We pick out the overall image, then we break it into its larger subcomponents, which consists of an arch at the top, the bright spot in the middle, and very specific shaped objects, such as the crescent moon shape right here, the same thing that we see right here, and the person sticking his arm out right here with the child underneath him, which is what we see right here, and I've even broken it down into its subcomponents to show that it's the same thing. So your next argument would be, well, okay, great, well, that looks like a match, but how do we know that this isn't just some kind of an isolated instance where you got lucky and that the images were, they just happened to match up fairly well and they look the same, but we can't prove that that's the Orion Nebula based on just this right here? And my answer to you would be that's correct. And as an analyst, I would say that the next thing that we have to do is we have to be able to prove repeatability. So in order to be able to prove something like this at this point, we must have repeatable instances of it. And even variations of the same location, where it may not be infrared, it might be visual. But we need to see some kind of repeatable type of instance, because right now we have a hypothesis. Once we build enough repeatability, we already have the science down. We understand this is not an ink blot test. We're doing image recognition. We're doing pattern matching. Once we have enough repeatable instances, then we have a good theory. And then once we can prove probability at a very, very high percentage, then it is a matter of you either accepting the truth or denying it. And as I said before, truth is one of those things where if you are caught up in whatever you want to believe or what you have to believe in order to feel comfortable, then your path is not truth. So let's take a look at some of the other instances of what we found here. Okay, so now while we're doing this in the process of looking for repeatable instances, it might also be a good idea to pay attention to what is being depicted in these cathedrals. For example, you might notice that you might want to put this in the back of your head, that the four-letter tetragrammaton, which is the name of Jehovah, it is the label which is being applied to this area right here, that is this bright area that you see. Another thing you might also want to pay attention to, so that we can kind of understand what's being depicted in this artwork, is that you see that we have this sun type thing here, and you see all of these angels or whatever circling around it. Okay? So those are some things to keep in the back of your head. And every time we find one of these types of repeatable instances of this, there is symbolic communication that is actually occurring inside these images. And they assist us in helping us understand the meaning, the underlying meaning of what we're actually looking at. So right here initially, as an analyst, what I would basically say is I see basically two things here. The four-letter tetragrammaton, Jehovah, is being applied to this bright area for whatever reason. I don't know yet. I just know that. And I notice that these guys are circling around this bright spot. That's what I know. So let's look for another repeatable instance. So here's our next image. Now, we already know that in the other cathedral that was showing us the Orion Nebula, we suspect that. It's our hypothesis. So our object is to find repeatable instances. So now we see this image right here. And a very interesting image, because we see this large cloud circling around this area. So in a sense, we're getting the same kind of a message here, in that we have this Fibonacci spiral. You can see how it circles into the middle of this bright area. Now, this time, what we see it labeled as, in the very center, is we see IHS, which is an acronym for Jesus. So that's another clue we have to take a look at here. But now, what are we looking at? Are we looking at the same size, or are we looking at something that may be a different variation of the Orion Nebula? Well, actually, we are looking at the same thing that we see here. When we look at the whole Orion constellation. And the large cloud that you see moving around the whole area is something called the Barnard's Loop. Now we have our overall that we're looking at right now. We have the same arch occurring in both areas, but now we have to break it down into its subcomponents again. So let's take a look at the original image. The original image, the cloud comes around down to here, kind of breaks, comes up here, and then it goes back over to the right again. Okay, so when we take a look at the Orion constellation, we see that it does the exact same thing. Now this is an image overlay, and this is much more accurate than what we saw in Karlskirch. The interesting thing about this particular image is that we're dealing with something also which hasn't been discovered yet. This painting or fresco was done in 1679 by Giovanni Battista Galli. The Orion Loop, which is what you see right here in both images, was not actually discovered until, I believe, the late 1800s. But if you notice, we have the same characteristics. The same cloud coming down, getting thicker down here, breaking, and then coming back up, and then going this way to the right, and then this way to the left. The bright area is contained right where the Orion Nebula is, and we can even find other areas. This is why it's always good to use these high-resolution images. This right here is the Horsehead Nebula, and then you see this little orange nebula right up here. Well, if we increase back to our original image again, you'll notice that we have the same orange nebula right here and the exact same shape of the Horsehead Nebula right here. Now we can also do things in these types of tests, which I'm going to show you real quick. It allows you to erase various sections to make sure that you're looking at the same images. So right here was our orange nebula. As you can see, it's in the exact same location. Take a look at the Horsehead Nebula, and you can see the same images right there. And then if we want to take a look at the Orion Nebula here, we might notice the overall shape. It's outlined in the Orion Nebula. The yellow area sticks out more over here to the right than it does over here on the left, and there's a reason for that. And that is because the actual cloud structures do the exact same thing on the Orion Nebula when we're looking at it. So right in the very center where IHS is the exact same area as the trapezium of the Orion Nebula, right in the very center. Now another thing that we can do to prove our case here, which is what we had to do eventually anyway, just to ensure, is we had to use something which is called sacred geometry. Now in these paintings, in these cathedrals, sacred geometry allows us to lock in the specific areas and make sure we're looking at the same areas. For example, you'll see that these circles that come around follow the path of the dome of the frame, and they are located in certain areas. You notice that the circle right here exactly covers this blue area, and at the very center of it is in the exact same area that we saw the trapezium of the Orion Nebula. The larger eye of this thing covers the area that extends out to that yellow area that you see right there on the right side of the Orion Nebula. And if we take the Church of the Jesu image off and look at the Orion constellation, we'll see that the same sacred geometry applies to both areas. Now this also allows us to zone in. Notice that the center of that flower is right on the trapezium, but now we can use the certain zones of the various areas inside this sacred geometry to key in and compare, almost like a grid by grid comparison between this and the original image. For example, if if I'm looking at this area right here, I can see that this big line passes through this orange area right here, the orange nebula. I can see that there's certain things right here. So if I turn back on the Church of the Jesu, I can see that that line passes right through the orange area, and that these areas are contained right where they're supposed to be geometrically as well. So now we have another repeatable instance. And this instance has a lot more repeatability than the last one. This is even better for us, because now we have several key places. We have this whole Orion loop containing the same structure. We have the Orion Nebula. We even have the Horsehead Nebula, and we have the this orange nebula which sits right above it up here. I think that may be I can't remember if that's the Flame Nebula or what, but it's the orange nebula that sits just above the Horsehead Nebula. So all of these things are in their same locations, but this is a much better match anyway, because this is an actual image overlay. We can see that the same things are occurring in these exact same locations. And what's even more amazing about this particular image is we get kind of a mystery associated with it, kind of like the Karlskirch, because where the Karlskirch was infrared, this is done in such detail. We didn't even have any telescopes that could see the Orion constellation like this. And yet this person did things with the various art inside here that is just such an extreme detail that it gives us more of a mystery. These types of building mysteries right here are things that piss Orthodox religious people off usually. It takes them out of their comfort zones. But it also frustrates the standard modern physical science people, because they just refuse to accept that anything can happen beyond what they've proven with their math formulas. Every day they continue to prove Hermetic philosophy. So there's our second instance. Well, okay, so now we have another interesting label here, because we have Jesus, which is associated to the very middle area here. So now we need to take a look and see if there are any other repeatable instances. Now I'm not going to obviously go through all of them. I wanted to show you some detail on a couple of these. I'm going to show you some detail on this next one. Actually, I'm going to show you a few more. I'm not going to go into their details, but I'm going to show you the symbolism, and then we're going to finalize it with the creation of Adam, and then we're going to show why that is significant. The creation of Adam was really the key in order to get to the underlying meanings of what is really going on here. Okay, this is our next image right here, and we have the same four patterns on both images. We have the crescent moon shape that we see here, and that we see on this side. We have this long image. These are the same two images, this one here and this one here, that we saw in Karlskirch. Then we have the this is the top of the nebula that we see right here, bright spot in the middle again, and notice that they're showing the same symbolism of Jehovah that we saw in Karlskirch. So that not only do we have a pattern match of the four distinct figures that are sticking out inside the nebula in these areas, but we also have the same bright spot corresponding to the same symbolism that was shown to us in Karlskirch. So now we have a cross-reference that we can deal with against Karlskirch. So as you can see, we are building our repeatability quite nicely. And I might add that in all of these instances that we've seen so far, the nebula seems to be the important area, but the real important area that we're seeing has to do with the trapezium of the Orion Nebula. You'll also notice too that once again we have what appears to be these angels circling around this bright spot right here. And what we're getting is a pattern. And in the Church of the Jesu, it was a Fibonacci spiral. And that shows us that something was circling into the middle. We're starting to get the impression here that we're dealing with some kind of a vortex, because something is spiraling out from the very center, which is being referred to as the trapezium. So this whole spiraling thing that we keep seeing occurring over and over, at this point in November of 2011, had led me to believe, to form another hypothesis while all of this discovery is going on at the same time, that the trapezium was important. I see this continual angel circling around the bright spot, and then it's really apparent in the Church of the Jesu because we see it as a Fibonacci spiral, and Fibonacci spirals get tighter and tighter as they move to the center. So I believed that we were dealing with some kind of a vortex. So then I began to make these videos because I believed there was a vortex located somewhere in the center of that trapezium. Some people may call it a black hole. It doesn't really matter what you call it because we don't really know what's in the center of a black hole right now. We have these theories. The electric universe has their theory. NASA has their theory. I don't think either of them are completely correct because I think there's something metaphysical that is going on here as well. And so this was in November of 2011. Formed this hypothesis. We had instant credibility because in November 2012, 1 year later, NASA mentioned that they believed that there to be a black hole in the very center of the trapezium area. Now, what this actually does is it gives us immediate credibility to the hypothesis because the artwork contained in the cathedrals, artwork that is representing something people should not be able to see at these times, yet have given us a clear communication that this type of thing is occurring. I made the video 1 year before NASA came out with this. I discovered it before NASA did. And that is instant credibility. And right here, you see that I've made a video right here. And this was, as soon as they came out with that, I made this particular video showing that they had confirmed what I had believed. That there was some kind of a vortex in the very center of the trapezium. Now, the vortex, we can get into that a little bit later, but that has a specific symbol associated with it as well. So, let's take a look. What else do we have now? We formed some interesting theories. In the center of that vortex, in the center of the trapezium, we have two labels so far. We have IHS, which stands for Jesus, or it stands for Christ, and we have the symbol for the Jehovah, the holy name, the Tetragrammaton. Well, now let's take a look at the Orion Nebula right here. This is a full-color Hubble version done in 2006. Might also interest you to know as well that because I didn't trust NASA either at first, these images have been cross-referenced against amateur photography as well, just to rule out the idea that something was fabricated. Once that was done and I realized I was looking at the same images, then I proceeded to use the most highest resolution, which is the NASA image. You might notice we have the same arch on both of these things, and we also have a triangle right here. And looking in the Bible, we see something very interesting. Because it says in Job 9:9, He made all the stars, the Bear, Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the southern sky. Well, that's a very, very specific thing to say. And we know that the Orion Nebula makes stars. It is a star nursery. It is also situated, if we look at the Orion constellation, the Orion constellation does not sit on a flat plane. All the stars in the Orion constellations are at various lengths from the Earth. The very furthest away in the constellation is the Orion Nebula. It's further than all the other stars. But now, what is our clue that the Orion Nebula and this verse right here may be dealing with the same thing? Well, you know, NASA has these ideas for how old the stars are and things like this, but then they say that the Orion Nebula is only 2 or 3 million years old. But NASA doesn't seem to be looking at the obvious visual data that's in front of them. Remember, when we looked at the Orion constellation, we had the Barnard's Loop circling into the middle where the Orion Nebula is. Let me show you some very interesting data. Right here we have the Orion constellations. We were looking at it where we can see the depth of where the various stars are. You see right here, I have them each labeled with their name, their apparent age according to NASA, and the number of light years away. So what I decided to do was I decided to chart their age versus their distance from the Earth. And here's what we see. we see that the age of Bellatrix is supposedly the oldest. And then we see Betelgeuse, and then we see Scythe, and then we see Rigel. And if you notice, there is a smooth line that runs right down the middle where we have age versus distance. So as we move from Bellatrix, and Bellatrix is right here, so as we move around this spiral, then this spiral right here is the closest to us, moving all the way out into the back where the Orion Nebula is. And as we move along these spiral, we have Bellatrix, we have Betelgeuse, we have Scythe, we have Rigel. And so the age, or these stars that we see right here, the age versus the distance, is following the pathway of this spiral. We can see that Bellatrix has actually even a trail coming off of it out of that spiral. So we see this almost a spinning motion. And so the very interesting thing about it is because when we get to the Orion Nebula, all these stars are following a smooth line, age versus distance, as they move to the Orion Nebula. And the very youngest stars are the stars that are closest to the Orion Nebula. Well, simple logic would tell you that if you have this particular visual image of this spiral circling into the Orion Nebula, that the stars are following the spiral and that their age gets younger as they move to the Orion Nebula, that more than likely the Orion Nebula is the one to blame for the creation of these stars. And therefore, if it has created these stars in the Orion constellation, it not only satisfies the idea that this area made the stars, but it also satisfies the idea that it made the Orion constellation. And it's also being referred to as Lord. And Lord in capital letters is the same as Tetragrammaton, the name for Jehovah. And then that satisfies the artwork that we see in the cathedrals. Here's another instance of the same thing, Orion Nebula infrared. And then we have Asimkirch, a painting in Asimkirch, and what we see is the four-letter Tetragrammaton, and we have these specific symbols again. We have the same lengthy symbol right here. We have our crescent moon that we have right here, and we have this top symbol as well on B, and those correspond to these particular areas as well, with the same bright spot corresponding to Jehovah again. So now we have three repeatable instances showing the same types of symbolism in the same locations. We see a reference to the Bible calling it Jehovah. We see that this light area right here is called Jehovah. We know that the Orion Nebula makes stars, and you can starting to see how as we continue to build repeatable instances, how everything is coming together. We see something is really special about this area called the trapezium of the Orion Nebula. So the pattern of the trapezium of the Orion Nebula started becoming apparent because I began to see that over and over again we would have these cloud bursts. We have the Holy Spirit, which is also found in the chair of St. Peter, showing the same sunburst with the same symbolism surrounding it that we saw, which is Jehovah. So this time we have the Holy Spirit in the middle. All of this comes into play when we start understanding what's going on here and what these people are depicting. But we see the same patterns of the Orion Nebula trapezium, and we can even see interesting details such as the impressions that we see in these images right here, and the geometry that we see associated with it. Here's another one. Again, we have IHS now associated to the trapezium of the Orion Nebula. And we've picked out several points to take a look at. We have this boot-looking shaped thing right here. We have this woman here, and we have this angel here, and they're surrounding this thing that looks very similar to the Orion Nebula trapezium. So when we perform our analysis on it, here's our boot shape, and we can see that that is repeated all the way through. Here's our angel repeated all the way through, and the very interesting one is this woman right here with her arms clasped and her shoulder performs this horseshoe shape and is also seen all the way through. So you can see it's very mysterious also, and you can see these three images up here together. The same geometry, same locations, same rotations, down to these very specific areas in what we're looking at right here. And once again, it's associated to IHS. This is El Greco, which is another one of these guys. This was done in 1580. Now, there are some that may have argued, well, a long time ago they could probably see the Orion Nebula better than we can now in all this smog. Perhaps, but not at Hubble quality, which is what we're looking at right here. Remember, at 1580 we hadn't even developed a telescope yet. Yet, the images that we're seeing here in detail are associated to something that we're dealing with, which is Hubble quality. This is another interesting image showing the Orion Nebula trapezium again. And what is also really interesting on this image is that the trapezium of the Orion Nebula, this little foamy area that you see on the left right here, is actually called, when we look at the trapezium, it's called the Orion Bright Bar, because it's foamy on this side right here and sticks out more than the others. But you'll also notice that the very shape of the images, and all of them, contain the same triangle. They contain the same bright area, which is contained right where his head is, where the trapezium stars are. And we can see that the brighter area sticking up above the triangle right here, all these things match up. And now we see Jesus standing right here, which would be the same symbolism that we've seen as IHS. So we see the specific importance given to the Orion Nebula trapezium, and another repeatable instance of it. So I began to perform analysis on what I was seeing. I was seeing a continual V shape that was happening associated with the Orion Nebula. I started putting patterns together, things that I was seeing, whether it be the Holy Dove, whether it be Christ, these various things that we see right here that I kept seeing over and over again. And it usually was some of the same artists that we would see doing it. The ones that were the culprits were Michelangelo, as we'll see, which was the best of all of them. And then we have Giovanni Battista Galli. But Giovanni Battista Galli actually was assisted in the Church of the Gesù, that one with the huge spiral going all the way into the middle, by Bernini. And Bernini was the same one that did the Chair of St. Peter, which is also an image of the Orion Nebula. Well, so it turns out that Bernini, as well as Michelangelo, were both Kabbalists. There's a book called Secrets of the Sistine Chapel by Rabbi Benjamin Bleck, whose book is actually on the New York Times bestseller list. And what he discovered in the Sistine Chapel was that Michelangelo was painting Hebrew letters on the ceiling, hidden in art. In fact, he discovered that everyone inside the Sistine Chapel were all Jewish, and that he was painting things regarding Kabbalah. And you will see that if you click on this video. I'll leave this video link in the description area. It's a 45-minute video where Rabbi Benjamin Bleck goes into this. But he didn't discover what he was actually painting in God Floating in His Cloud, which is what we're going to take a look at next. This is going to be our final repeatable instance, and we're going to see that the level of detail in this particular image is so high that we're dealing with a probability factor on top of all of the other instances that brings us to a point where you either accept this as something that's occurring, as a phenomena, or you don't follow the path of truth. This fresco, which is probably one of the most well-known frescoes and paintings, and probably right up there with the Mona Lisa, this is the real code. This is the real code. It's not like the Dan Brown, which is a fiction writer. This is actually the real code that we're dealing with right here. Michelangelo was very clear when he did this particular painting. And the level of detail is so high that we're going to see when we zoom into these various areas that there really is no debunking it at all. And I challenge any scholar, I challenge anyone out there with all of the repeatable instances that I've shown you, and particularly with this image right here. I'm telling you, you cannot debunk this image recognition matching and repeatable instances are going on right now. I welcome you to. I welcome any scholar out there to put this to rest, and you cannot do it. When we take a look at the overall image here, we can see that we're looking at an overall image that is very similar. But when we begin to break it down into its details, then we get to see things like the repeatable instances of God's arm passing where her head is right in the middle of her arm, his arm. And we can see the same repeatable instances all the way through. We can see that her head is in the same area, same rotation, same shape, same size, with the arm passing right by her just like it does on each one of these images. But now let's go into even higher detail. This is now a sample zoomed in just to the area of where God's head is. Everything else is in the same place. And what we see is that the same impressions, the ridge of his eye, his cheek, where his ear is, these are all in the same location, even his hair. And when we get down here and even examine the ear, this is all nebula right here. And we have the same patterns, same shading of the ear in all the locations. And so we're dealing with an area of this whole painting that's this small, and yet it still contains the same images. This is the same type of algorithm that we were showing earlier when we showed how TinEye locates images, except this right here exceeds the capability of the algorithm, because the human eye has the capability to recognize patterns with a much more subtle approach than a computer does, yet we can see that these images are the same. Here's another blow-up area of the same area. You can see that the mouth is in this same location every time. These eyes are located in the same location. His cheek, and notice that the ear is the same in all these images, and even his hair comes out in all of these in the same place. And this right here, these types of things, allow this to where it cannot be debunked. When you take a look at this in comparison to the other areas, the woman, her face, all these other areas in the painting, and the most magical thing about it all is he painted it in 1511, 100 years before the first telescope was ever discovered or invented. And here's where an important link comes into play. Because we know that from the work of Rabbi Benjamin Black that Michelangelo was a catalyst. We also know that Michelangelo was an anatomist, and he knew the human body very well. And the image of the brain has already been understood by many to be what he painted inside this floating figure right here. This has several meanings to it, but when you understand Kabbalah, it has even more meaning to it. But one of the things that people have typically done is they have turned this brain around the opposite direction. The correct direction of the brain is actually when it's facing in this direction, facing to the right. And that's also important when we take a look at Kabbalah, because when we read about the Ancient of Days is the profile of a face facing to the right, which is exactly what we see right here. And we can also see that the fold that comes along this thing comes back in and comes back out. This is the occipital lobe dividing from the cerebellum. And he put very specific things on the clothing of God. For example, this area right here, this fold that sits on top of him, is actually the fornix. And the fold that you see right here is actually the midbrain. And his arm is the corpus callosum. So he's painted a brain. But when we understand Kabbalah and we understand what that means, then all the pieces of this puzzle, all of the symbolism that we've seen so far, from Christ being inside the trapezium to Jehovah being inside the trapezium to what we've seen in the Bible and everything else in the Old Testament regarding he makes all the stars and the constellations of the southern sky, the Lord is his name. All of the pieces of the puzzle begin to start coming together. And it is this point, with all these repeatable instances and what we saw in the creation of Adam to such a high detail, that I was now convinced that what I was seeing was definitely the Orion Nebula occurring over and over. And as we will find, that it occurs continually, and it will eventually take us to Egypt. But we have an interesting mathematical association that we can perform here now, because we know that Michelangelo painted a brain. And since we know that he painted a brain, and we have the image recognition to show that he painted the Orion Nebula also, then there's something called mathematical association. If A is equal to B, and if B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. So if he painted the brain, and he painted the Orion Nebula, then the Orion Nebula is a brain. And we can see that when we take a look at the Orion Nebula right here, it has the same characteristics and can be labeled into a very high degree to show that it actually is a brain. The next obvious thing to do was to take the profile of a human brain, a sagittal version of the brain, and put them together here to see what they looked like. And interestingly, they all match up, even down to the details such as the optic chiasm, or the optic nerve that we see right here. And the yellow triangle that you see when the overlay is performed, the vortex, or the black hole that sits in there that I discovered a year before NASA, sitting in the middle of that yellow triangle. When we follow our eyes all the way through here, noticing the shape of the corpus callosum all the way around here, that yellow triangle and its vortex sit in the same area as this black triangle that sits right here. And the vortex is located in the same area as the pineal gland would be located in the brain. So the Orion Nebula trapezium is associated to the pineal gland. Why would Michelangelo paint this? When you understand Kabbalah, you understand why. I'm going to leave it here, this being part 1, and in part 2 we'll dig into some more of the details, and we're going to head over to Egypt to see what they have for us and see if there's anything else repeating of what we've seen in the cathedrals in Egypt, the hieroglyphs, the temples, and any other areas that might give us a clue to what is actually going on. So stay tuned for part 2.